Having gotten a basic idea of what Joshua is about, let's start working through it a little more slowly. You'll notice that Joshua begins with Israel entering into the promised land in chapters 1 through 5. And in verses 1 through 9 of chapter 1, we read about God calling Joshua to lead the people into the promised land. And we can certainly imagine how intimidated Joshua must have felt after Moses died. After all, the person he was following was larger than life. The first 5 verses of Joshua 1 actually are dominated by Moses. His name is mentioned 5 times. He's described as the servant of the Lord, where Joshua is simply described as Moses' assistant. And yet, in spite of Moses' greatness, even Moses had failed to get the people into the promised land. He even was unable to get into the promised land himself. Besides the intimidating nature of following Moses, there's the huge task itself. He was to conquer a vast amount of territory. God says in verse 4, from the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, towards the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. And so if you were to put yourself in Joshua's shoes, it makes understanding the opening chapter easier. What questions would we be asking if God gave us this great task? God, how can I do this? Lord, these people, this role, it's me. There's no way. The answer to those questions is clear if you look at the opening verses. It comes in 2 parts. To discover the first key, read these passages with me and see if you can explain how Israel is going to accomplish all of this. Chapter 1, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. 1 verse 3, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised Moses. 1 verse 5, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave or forsake you. 1 verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. 1 verse 11, pass through the midst of the camp and command the people, prepare your provisions, for within 3 days you're to pass over this Jordan to go in to take possession of the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Chapter 1, verse 13, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. Chapter 1, verse 15, you shall return to the land of your possession and shall possess it, the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise. How are they going to accomplish this? It's very clear. They're not. God is going to accomplish it through them. God is going to do this because God is faithful to his promises. That's the first thing we see in Joshua 1. Now, what do the people need if that's going to happen? That's the second thing we learn. Chapter 1, verse 7, only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Chapter 1, verse 8, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. Chapter 1, verse 18, whoever rebels against your commandment and disobeys your words, whatever you command him shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous. So on the one hand, Joshua 1 is about God keeping his word. And on the other hand, it's a call to God's people to keep God's word. And if we go to the end of Joshua, Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45, and Joshua 24, 31 through 32, what does it tell us about God and his word? Joshua 21, 43 through 45 says, Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. Verse 45, not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. So God kept his word. In fact, one good summary I've heard of the book of Joshua is this: God's people must keep God's word because God always keeps his word. God always keeps his word. Now, how will Joshua carry out this commission? We begin to get glimpses in verses 10 through 18. God told Joshua to arise and go over the Jordan. So verse 11, Joshua did. Joshua commanded the officers of the people, get ready because we're about to pass over the Jordan. There was one group of people, though, that it would have been difficult to motivate to come along with Joshua, and that's the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Why? Because they had already received their inheritance. Why would they want to go to war now? So Joshua reminds them of Moses' command in verses 13 through 15, and his motivation is very simple. God said to do this, so you must do this. And the tribes demonstrate the kind of obedience that Israel must persevere in if they're going to be a success. They answer Joshua in verse 17, all that you have commanded us, we will do. And they honor Moses, but their response shows where their hope of victory really comes from. They say, only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Now, after that first chapter, we would expect to go straight to the story that's told in chapter 3, verse 1. But instead, we have this entire chapter in the middle that is devoted to the spying out of Jericho. And I'm so glad that we do. One of the great difficulties that many people have understanding the book of Joshua is the seeming ruthlessness of the people of Israel as they battled against the Canaanites, and especially the fact that this ruthlessness was commanded by God. In fact, there's a phrase that you're going to find coming up repeatedly throughout the book of Joshua. Read these verses with me and see if you spot it. What phrase is repeated in chapter 6, verse 18 and 21, and chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. Chapter 6, verse 18. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. Verse 21, we'll just fast forward. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. Chapter 7, verse 1. But the people of Israel broke faith in regard to the devoted things. Achan took some of the devoted things. Verse 12 of chapter 7. Therefore, the people of Israel cannot stand before their enemies. They turn their back before their enemies because they have become devoted for destruction. And I'm sure you heard it. It's not too easy to miss. Devoted to destruction. And that phrase comes from a command that God gave in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 through 18 says this, and it's from God, but in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. And he has a reason that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they've done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Now, many people, of course, struggle with that concept, but we have to remember first the reason that it's given there. God was protecting his people from the danger of unholiness. And one reason we have such a hard time appreciating God's wrath against sin is because we don't appreciate how sinful we are. As C.S. Lewis once wrote, when we merely say that we are bad, the wrath of God seems a terrible doctrine. As soon as we perceive our badness, it appears inevitable, a mere implication of God's goodness. The Canaanites were wicked. In fact, the following passage explains one reason Israelites were being given the land. Read this with me and see if you can spot it. Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 5. Not because of your rightness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. These nations were wicked. They were being punished. This was about the judgment of God. And God actually already told Abraham this. If you look back at Genesis chapter 15, verse 16, God says why he's not giving Abraham's descendants the land right away. Genesis 15, verse 16, he says, they shall come back here in the fourth generation, like 400 years, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And while there might be some concepts there that are a little difficult for us to process, one thing actually that is illustrated is the patience of God with the people who were living in Canaan. They were a very wicked people. They worshiped idols. The stories that are told about the Canaanite gods actually often involved incest, and not surprisingly, as a result, the Canaanites often practiced incest, and they treated it as if it were something small. One example of how lightly incest was taken is found in what Lot's daughters did after they fled Sodom, which was a Canaanite city. That was fairly normal to them in Sodom. Adultery was common. Sexual immorality was even part of the way they worshiped. They practiced child sacrifice. Homosexuality was common, and even bestiality was not frowned upon. One author explains, Israel was warned not to let the Canaanites live in their land, but to completely destroy them, because otherwise the Canaanites would, 1, be barbs in the Israelites' eyes, 2, the Israelites would intermarry with the Canaanites, 3, the Israelites would consequently learn the Canaanite ways. Yahweh warned that if the Israelites then began to worship other gods, the land would vomit them out so that they would be scattered and most would be destroyed, just as it had vomited out the nations before them. So this was about judgment. And yet, when the Israelites come as an instrument of God's judgment, it's only after hundreds of years that God has been demonstrating his mercy and patience with them. And with that context, understanding the justice of God and the wickedness of the Canaanites, the question is not just do these people deserve judgment, but also what would God do if someone was this wicked and they were a Canaanite and yet they trusted God's promises of mercy? Would God judge them in the same way? And in the second chapter of the book of Joshua, we come across a stunning example of God's mercy to the Gentiles who fled to him and trusted in his promises. I think you know the story. Joshua sends these spies into the land, and they come to the house of a prostitute named Rahab, and they stay there. And it obviously seems like a strange place for them to stay, but you have to remember this was a time of war, so obviously the spies had to be smart about where they stayed. And one place people wouldn't be surprised that strange men went would be a prostitute's house. And the city was on high alert. By the time they got to Rahab's house, people had already alerted the king, actually. They said, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. They even seem to have some idea that the spies have gone to Rahab's house. The king sends someone to Rahab, telling her to bring out the men that have stayed at her house. This then is where you would expect the story to end. But Rahab does something unexpected. She puts her life on the line in the place of the men, deceiving those who had come to kill them. Now, this is where we sometimes get a little distracted, because the obvious question that we want an answer for when we read this story is whether or not it was right for Rahab to lie. Is it fine to lie if someone's life is on the line? And we can talk about that question, but that's not what this story is primarily about. When we come up to this story, we have to ask, why is it here? Because really the book of Joshua doesn't need it. You could take this chapter out and you could read through Joshua and understand what's happening with Israel's conquest of the land quite clearly. This woman is being seen as having done something extraordinary. She's mentioned several times in the New Testament, and in the New Testament, it's her faith that's on display. Rahab really had no earthly reason for doing what she did with these men. They were strangers to her. Besides, she was putting the city in which she lived at risk. They had come as part of God's plan to destroy Jericho. So why did she do this? She explains why she did it in verses 9 through 11 of chapter 2. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came up out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. And this trust in God, this recognition that Yahweh alone is God, led her to plead with the spies to show her mercy. And we need to make sure that we admire, actually, Rahab's faith and Rahab's response. Francis Schaeffer writes, she was surrounded by a hostile and awesome environment. She was surrounded by a whole city that really thought one way. She was pressured by a powerful city and an ancient culture. At the moment, she could see nothing with her eyes, which indicated Jericho would fall. Nevertheless, Rahab knew, and what she knew was totally against her culture. She believed in a new God, a God totally and diametrically opposed to the gods of Jericho. She stood for the unseen against the seen, standing in real danger until Jericho fell. And the result of Rahab's faith was that God showed her mercy and delivered her from judgment, which again is just so surprising if you think about it, because this is a story, Joshua, about the judgment of the Canaanites. And the very first story we read in Joshua is about how God delivered a Canaanite from judgment who put her faith in him. And this was a very wicked Canaanite woman at that. What does that say about God? One man writes of this story, what we have here is the way God intends to accomplish his purpose through Israel in saving a Gentile world. This is the Old Testament, after all, and the first person we meet in this story is a Gentile who is a believer. In Jericho, of all places, God had been working in this woman's heart through the things that she had heard and the things which these spies now confirmed to her, saving faith. Isn't that wonderful? It's like going to a yard sale and buying something for a few pennies and then discovering it's worth a fortune. What it's saying to us is that before you get there, God has already been working. He has been preparing the way. He's been making it possible. That's the kind of God we have. He blazes a trail for us to follow in. We talk about pioneer missionaries and pioneer church planners, but God is the pioneer church missionary. He is the pioneer church planner. I will build my church in the face of the gates of hell, and the residents of hell will not be able to do one thing about it. And the way the spies protect her is by having her tie a scarlet cord to her window, and that cord sets her apart from the others. As God is exercising his judgment on Jericho, her house will be a safe place. As long as they stay inside the house, they'll be safe. If they go outside the house, they'll be judged. The spies then return, and they give a report to Joshua that is far different than that of the original spies who were sent all those years earlier. They say, truly, the Lord has given the land into our hands. In fact, the inhabitants of the land melt away in fear because of us. And ultimately, this story shows us that God's mercy is not small. He is happy to show mercy to those who trust in him. But even though it's not the main part of the story, we could ask, was Rahab's lie justified? How would you answer that question? There's a couple different ways you could answer it. Some would say, well, two absolutes are coming into conflict here. Spare a life or don't lie. And they will argue that when these two absolutes come into conflict, you have no other choice but to lie. That's just the way the world is. Others would say there are absolutes and then there are absolutes. You know, there's a kind of gradation of absolutes, you might say. So don't lie is important, but don't murder is even more important. But there is a third option, and this is basically that we don't get the whole story here. Basically, and I'm quoting Walt Kaiser here, he says, these absolutes only appear to be in conflict, or they are in conflict, but there is a third way which we cannot see. In other words, her lie was wrong, even though she told it for a good purpose. But she could have said something different without actually lying, and the outcome would have been the same. I'm not sure which of those three options you would choose, but that's not the main point of the text. The main point is God's mercy. To conquer the land, Israel needs to obey. That's chapter 1. In conquering the land, God is judging those who don't obey. That's chapters 3 and following. But he will show mercy to disobedient people who come to him in faith. That is chapter 2. And we'll look at the following chapters in the videos to come.